But nevertheless, such categories are taken mostly for granted when we talk about Marx. And I cannot go deeper in this discussion. I just want to say we have very cautious in using such categories. When we now come to discussing value theory, an additional historical difficulty emerges. Just a few years after Marx published Capital Volume 1 in the year 1867, the so-called marginal revolution started in economics. Karl Menger in Austria, Léon Walras in Switzerland, and William Stanley Jevons in England published independently studies promoting the so-called marginal utility theory. It was a new approach to bring utility into economic thinking. Adam Smith denied that utility can explain value. The marginalists, with this marginal utility, renewed the approach, and it lasted only 20 years that this new approach became dominant. And this had enormous consequences for the perception and also for the discussion of Marx's value theory. The tradition of the marginalists, they created a new view on the possible value theories. On the one hand, it was said we have the so-called objective theories of value, resting on labor production costs. On the other hand, we have the subjective theories of value. They are built on consumer preferences and utility. In this distinction, Marx and the classical political economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo are in one camp. The differences between them are minimized. And for many readers, no matter if Marxists or critics of Marx, the original claim of Marx to deliver a fundamental critique of classical political economy disappeared. So it was only the question, a labor theory, when we talk about value, do we have a labor theory of value, or do we have a utility theory of value? But I think this way of framing value theory is totally misleading, not only at Marx, already with Smith. Smith justified labor as a measure of value by the subjective evaluation of the producer, where he said, yes, labor is the real cost because it provokes misery to the producer, and he will not have an exchange of a labor product with something else which he can get for less labor. So Adam Smith, in a subjective way, gave reason to the so-called objective approach to value theory. So I think all these distinctions, objective, subjective, labor theories, utility theories, have only a very, very limited use, but nevertheless they are used in a way as if we can take them for granted. A last point I want to mention what is important for our present perception of Marx, or of not of Marx theory in general, but of capital. Capital has, as we know, 3 volumes. Unfortunately, most people read only volume 1, but the 3 volumes of Capital form a unit. Very important categories like profit and interest, appear only in volume 3. When you don't know what Marx means with profit, you will automatically tend to confuse surplus value category of volume 1 with profit and entrepreneurial gain categories of volume 3. So we really need all 3 volumes to read. But when we look to history, volume 1 appeared in the year 1867. Volume 3, after Marx's death, edited by his friend Frederick Engels, appeared nearly 30 years later in 1894. And while volume 1 was nicely finished by Marx, was nicely presented by Marx, volume 2 and 3, Engels had to construct out of unfinished manuscripts, and to read it is much more difficult than to read volume 1. As a result, since 100 years, we have the situation that volume 1 dominates the reception of capital. Volume 1 deals with the production process of capital, and many Marxists, as well as Marx critics, believe here we find the real core of Marx's analysis of capitalism, and what is said in volume 2 or 3 are some details, additional details. We must not go too much in depth occupying with them, and I think this is a very wrong interpretation, a very wrong accentuation of capital. So these were some very brief remarks about the historiography of our own position, that we have to be cautious to take things for granted which are the result of a certain historical process. We just shouldn't trust what is offered as categories, things we can take for granted. Now I come to my second point, the historiography of Marx's analysis of value. In general, we have to put Marx's theoretical texts much more in the conflicts of his times than this is usually done. Most readers of Capital, they want to learn something about contemporary capitalism. It is said, yes, Marx is an important author, he has something to say, read it. And they read it, but most readers are not clear about the fact that all Marx texts, also Capital, is an intervention in debates, in conflicts, in struggles of his times. It is not a timeless analytical effort to contribute to the wisdom of human mankind. And so we have to reconstruct all these contemporary, for Marx, contemporary struggles and debates in order to get a deeper understanding of the writings. And you mentioned my Marx biography. This is one of the main tasks of this biography. It is not to tell you every detail of Marx's life and what was his dinner on Sunday evening or something like that. No, I think we need the biography for really have the context of his writings, to understand the conflicts, to understand also Marx standing in these conflicts, which was changing. Marx was all his lifetime an extremely learning subject who had no problems to admit that something what he wrote or said 2 years ago was wrong, that he had now a new insight which has to be taken into account. This, by the way, is also a reason that why so many of Marx's works, including Capital, were not finished, because he was permanently learning. He did not just fulfill a program and send the manuscript to the reader. So just for Capital, I think I can say that it was not finished in the 70s. It had, of course, one of the reasons there that Marx was sick in the 70s, that also in the early 70s he was politically very engaged, very active, but also in the 1870s he extended the plan for Capital considerably. And I would say he extended it even so much that even when he lived 10 years more and would have the best health, he wouldn't be able to finish this extremely ambitious project. And also this we have to have in mind when we discuss about Capital, that we have not one finished project. We have an evolving project. We have to see how things are developing. I will come back to this point in short. Now I just want to give you a very, very rough idea what were the struggles behind Capital. Marx, of course, dealt with the existing political economy. This political economy was one of the main justifying sciences for capitalism. So it was not just a scientific debate, it was a debate about a science which has central importance for capitalism. And in these times, in Capital, he made the famous distinction between classical political economy on the one hand, which he accepted as a scientific approach, a bourgeois approach, but nevertheless a scientific approach, and vulgar economics, which was not really scientific. It remained on the surface, and in the course of time, more and more this what he called vulgar economics became more and more apologetic. It was clear for the writers we have to defend capitalism and we have to present capitalism in a way that it is the best world ever. But there is a third branch, not so, Marx made it not so prominent, but you can see it in some footnotes, in some remarks. This was especially the German economists of his time. He considered German economists of his time even worse than the vulgar economists. Germany developed rather late economically. It was behind England and France in the first half of the 19th century. So there was not really an empirical basis for doing political economy. And the German economists took some fragments from Adam Smith, Ricardo, say, which they not even really understood. They mixed it up with some German historical consideration, and the result for Marx was not at all a serious project. Another frontline for Marx were competing socialist thinkers, for example, Proudhon, who he mentioned several times in Capital. They also made use of classical political economy in a way which Marx criticized very much. So Marx had to fight against very different camps in his Capital. I will mention later what this means for certain points. But now I have to mention in this paragraph just one one point regarding the publication of Capital. I said the German economists were even worse than the vulgar economists in England and France. But in which language and where Capital was published? In Germany. Marx, in his letters, said, oh, nobody really discusses Capital, and he talked about a conspiracy of silence. My idea is there was not so much a conspiracy of silence against the book. There was, the German economists in the majority were really unable to understand the book. They were before unable to understand really classical political economy, and so they didn't understand the critique of classical political economy. They also thought that it is not necessary to criticize because the critique of the Germans was, oh, David Ricardo is too abstract. We cannot use such an abstract theory, and this was reason enough to say, oh, we must not occupy. But now you can say, okay, Marx's book was not, it didn't aim to the academic debate in Germany. It was a book with socialist aims. It was written to support the proletarian the proletarian revolution. A book for workers. But could the workers really make use of capital in this time? There were first the selling price of the book. The first edition had a price which was around the weekly income of a skilled worker. So for the most workers in Germany, the book was not affordable. In the first edition, also Marx didn't, and also in later editions, he didn't translate the quotes from foreign languages. You could find 5 different languages in Capital: ancient Greek, Latin, English, French, and Italian. He used a lot of terms from ancient mythology, philosophy, world literature, and so on. So it was really a book for the educated, very well educated reader, and these were in these times mainly the bourgeoisie. So it is not surprising that his book was not really a success in the first years after it was published. And when finally, 20 years after the first edition, an English translation appeared, then Marx's opponent, classical political economy, already had vanished. Marginalists were ruling. So the book looked like a relic of an old time which has no meaning for the present times. So regarded under marketing aspects, Capital during the first 20 years was really a disaster. And also, of course, this then influenced the reception. Now, I want to come to my next point before I then really come to the critical issues of value theory. I mentioned that we need a critical reading of Marx's texts. There is not only in reading Marx, but also in reading a lot of other so-called classical authors, a tendency to look for a last version where the author said what he really wanted to say. In most cases, the search for such an illusionary, for such a last version is really illusionary. In Germany, this insight is rather old, and it led to the so-called critical editions. not only to edit the so-called last version of a book, but to publish all the versions of the book, to publish also all the changes in a single text. In Germany, we have fortunately the Mega, the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, which it is not finished, but which gives such a critical edition, which then makes possible such a critical reading. What this critical reading had, the impact of this critical reading, even for volume 1, to illustrate this, I just give you one example. You can hear very often the opinion that the French translation of volume 1 is the last version, because chronologically it appeared after the first two German editions, and it was really the last edition which was on which Marx was working. He checked the translation